In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled and American forces pushed deep into Bavaria, 43 young German women found themselves facing a fate they never imagined possible. These weren't soldiers or criminals, they were secretaries, nurses, and administrators who had simply worked within the German military system, and now that was enough to make them prisoners. The American soldiers who rounded them up showed a coldness that frightened them more than outright cruelty ever could, loading them onto trucks without explanation, leaving their belongings and their futures behind in total uncertainty. They ranged from 19 to 45 years old, some with husbands still fighting, others already widowed, many with children evacuated to safety somewhere in the countryside, and all of them shared one terrifying question that no one could answer: what comes next? The Americans gave no explanations, spoke no German, and seemed completely indifferent to the desperate pleas and questions that filled the air as the trucks rolled toward an uncertain destination. The camp they arrived at was hastily constructed, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, and the American soldiers stationed there seemed almost bored by their arrival, as if processing German women was just another routine task in the chaotic final days of the war. The women were separated immediately, placed in a cordoned section away from male prisoners, given one thin blanket each, and told to sleep in a large canvas tent that offered no protection from the still frigid German spring nights. There was one latrine for all 43 women, positioned at the very end of the compound, and the humiliation of walking past American soldiers every single time they needed to use it felt like punishment, though no one ever stated it that way. On the first morning, they woke to find a young American soldier standing outside their tent with a loudspeaker, maybe 22 or 23 years old, with kind eyes that seemed strangely out of place on a man in uniform. Through broken German words and gestures, he explained that breakfast would be served, and as the women emerged blinking into the pale morning light, they were pointed toward a food line that smelled like something they hadn't experienced in months: fresh bread. The kitchen tent filled the air with the scent of real coffee and real bread being baked, and some of the women actually had tears streaming down their faces just from the smell of it, because in Germany's final months, even those who weren't fighting had been going hungry. The young soldier with the kind eyes served the food himself, handing each woman a plate with bread, a small piece of cheese, and a cup of ersatz coffee, more food than many of them had seen in weeks, and as he gave each woman her plate, he smiled at them as if they were actual people who deserved kindness, as if they weren't the enemy at all. Greta, one of the older women who had worked as a secretary at a Wehrmacht headquarters and was old enough to remember the First World War, watched this young American with deep suspicion and whispered to the woman beside her that the food must be poisoned or drugged or infected with disease, that they absolutely should not eat it. Anna, the woman next to her, was only 22 and had been a nurse at a military hospital, and she knew exactly what starvation looked like and what it did to the human body. She knew that refusing food was basically slow suicide, but she was also terrified because everything they had been taught about American soldiers was horrific. The propaganda had shown them twisted images of what Americans would do to captured German women. The radio had told them stories of atrocities, and now here they were being offered bread and smiles, and it made no sense at all. The other women began eating slowly and carefully, as if the bread might transform into something terrible in their mouths. But it didn't. It was just good bread, and they ate hungrily despite their fear, unable to restrain themselves any longer. The young soldier watched them eat with an expression that looked suspiciously like genuine compassion, and after breakfast they were told through more gestures and broken German that they would be assigned work around the camp, organizing supplies, cleaning equipment, doing laundry, nothing difficult, just simple work for a few hours each day. The women looked at each other in confusion because prisoners were supposed to be punished and made to suffer, weren't they? But this work assignment suggested that the Americans actually saw them as people, as workers, not as conquered enemies to be tormented. Sophia, who had been a telephone operator at Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin before the Soviet advance forced the government to relocate, raised her hand because she spoke a little English learned in school before the war, and she asked carefully in halting English whether they would receive payment for their work. The young soldier seemed genuinely pleased by her attempt at English, smiled enthusiastically, and nodded, saying yes, small payment, you can buy things at the canteen, things you need, and he told them through more gestures that his name was Sergeant Thomas Fletcher, that he was from a place called Missouri in America where he had a farm, that he had a wife waiting for him back home, that he wanted to go home, and that he had absolutely no desire to be cruel to them. The women were assigned their various tasks throughout the camp, some working in the supply depot organizing the endless streams of materials flowing through, others in the laundry cleaning clothes for both American soldiers and the increasing number of German prisoners arriving daily, and Anna was assigned to work in the small medical clinic that had been set up, where an older American medic named Corporal Stephen Martinez, with the bearing of someone with years of medical training, looked at her carefully and asked slowly in English if she had medical training. Anna nodded and said simply, nurse, German nurse, military hospital, and Martinez seemed satisfied with this answer and showed her around the small clinic, which was nothing like the hospital where she had worked because it was cleaner, better supplied, more organized, with real antibiotics in the cabinet, not substitutes or improvised alternatives, and clean gauze and clean bandages and clean everything. So much abundance that Anna felt almost overwhelmed because in Germany, especially in the final months, supplies had become virtually non-existent and hospitals had been running on almost nothing for months. Martinez handed Anna an apron and a mask and told her simply that she would help him, that they would see all patients with the same care, German, American, Italian, it didn't matter, everyone would get the same treatment, and he asked her directly if that was clear. Anna nodded, completely unsure what to make of this philosophy, and the first patients began arriving, an American soldier with a sprained ankle, a German prisoner with an infected cut, an Italian prisoner of war with a fever, and Martinez treated them all with the same careful attention, gentle and thorough with each one, taking time to explain what he was doing even though most of them didn't understand English, acting as though their pain actually mattered, as though their health was important. That afternoon, a young German soldier was brought in with severe burns on his back, maybe 18 years old at most, injured in a truck accident within the camp, and the boy was absolutely terrified and in extreme pain. Martinez began treating the burns with clean water and antibiotics and sterile bandages, and every time the boy cried out in pain, Martinez's face showed genuine sadness at causing him suffering even though it was necessary treatment. And when the boy asked in German whether he would live, whether the burns would heal properly, Martinez looked directly at Anna and told her to tell the boy yes. Tell him his wounds will heal. They're not as bad as they look. Tell him he's going to be fine. Anna translated and watched the boy's face completely transform as relief flooded over him, because he had been trained in the German army to expect absolutely no mercy from the Americans, and the idea that they would actually work to heal him, to make sure he lived, seemed completely impossible, yet here it was happening right in front of him. The boy's gratitude was almost painful to witness, and Anna found herself struggling to maintain her composure because she had been taught that Americans were barbaric and cruel and without honor, that German women captured by American soldiers would be raped and killed, that the only honorable thing to do was find a way to kill herself rather than face that fate. But here she was working alongside an American medic who had shown nothing but kindness and professionalism, and her entire worldview was beginning to crack at the edges. That evening back in the tent with the other women, Anna tried to explain what she had experienced, how the medic Corporal Martinez had treated patients with real compassion, spent time with them, explained what he was doing, listened carefully when she translated, and seemed to genuinely care whether they lived or died. Greta snorted derisively and said of course he treats them well. He wants us to believe they're civilized so we'll lower our guard and then they'll hurt us, you're being naive. But Anna didn't argue further even though she couldn't quite believe Greta's interpretation anymore. Days passed and then weeks, the spring weather improved. The women received regular meals that were not lavish but were consistent and adequate and most importantly real food, not the substitutes and supplements they had been eating during Germany's final months of war. Sophia continued working in the supply depot and found herself talking regularly with Sergeant Fletcher, who brought a small notebook with him one day filled with German words and their English translations because he was trying to learn German so he could communicate better with the prisoners. And he showed Sophia the notebook with something like pride, pointing at the words and saying slowly, "See, I learned your language so we could talk. It's important to talk, to understand." Sophia was genuinely struck by the effort because no one had ever made this kind of effort for her before. She was being treated as worth the time and energy to communicate with, and Fletcher's German was absolutely terrible. His pronunciation was awful, but his effort was so genuine it almost hurt. Fletcher began telling Sophia about Missouri, about his farm, about his wife Sarah, who he had been married to for only 2 years before being drafted, about how he wanted to return home and have children and grow corn and raise cattle and live a peaceful life, and he spoke about these things with such longing that it became absolutely clear to Sophia that he was fundamentally a farmer who had been forced into being a soldier, not by nature a man of war at all. One afternoon Fletcher brought Sophia something from his own rations, a piece of candy, American chocolate, pressing it into her hand quietly while looking around to make sure no one was watching, saying in broken German, "For you, you work hard, you good person, it's against rules but it's right thing." The chocolate was small and simple, but it represented something absolutely enormous. An American soldier was risking trouble to show her kindness. He saw her as worthy of that kindness, and that afternoon Sophia shared the chocolate with the other women, breaking it into tiny pieces so each of them could have a taste. And as they sat together eating it, most of them began to cry because the chocolate was good, but more importantly, it represented a massive crack in the propaganda they had been fed their entire lives. Meanwhile, Anna continued working in the medical clinic with Corporal Martinez, and her work expanded as the number of patients increased because the camp was receiving more and more prisoners as American forces advanced deeper into Germany and captured more soldiers and civilians. And Martinez came to rely completely on Anna's translations and her medical knowledge, teaching her new techniques, showing her how to use modern medical equipment, explaining the scientific reasoning behind treatments. And Anna absorbed all of this knowledge eagerly because it was absolutely clear that Martinez respected her intelligence and her dedication to helping patients. One day a German woman was brought to the clinic, maybe 35 years old and severely traumatized, found by American soldiers in a town devastated by bombardment where she had been trapped in a basement with the bodies of her family for 3 days. And she was in shock, barely responsive, terrified of everyone around her. Martinez looked at Anna and said they needed to help her, but she was too frightened and wouldn't let them touch her. "You're German, you're a woman, maybe she'll let you help. Can you try?" Anna spent hours with this traumatized woman, sitting with her, speaking to her in German, holding her hand, explaining what was happening, and slowly, very slowly, the woman began to calm down enough to accept medical care, and Martinez was gentle and patient throughout, giving the woman warm drinks and bandaging her wounds and administering sedatives to help her sleep. And by the end of the day, the woman was stable and resting comfortably. Anna realized with stunning clarity that Martinez was exactly what she had been taught to hate. He was American, he was strong and powerful, but he was using that strength and power to help people, not to harm them. And that evening as Anna was leaving the clinic, Martinez stopped her and said, "You did good work today. You have the instincts of a good nurse. When the war is over and you go home, you should return to nursing. You should help people, that's your gift." Anna felt tears streaming down her face because no American had ever spoken to her that way. No one had ever recognized her skills or encouraged her future. In Germany, her future had been entirely prescribed by the state. She was supposed to serve the Reich, and that was all. But the idea that she could have dreams of her own, that she could dedicate herself to nursing and helping people, that was an absolute revelation. The camp continued its strange existence where the women were technically prisoners but were treated with respect, fed adequately, paid small wages, given medicine when sick, shown kindness, and it was driving them slowly insane because everything they had been taught suggested this was completely impossible. Greta became increasingly agitated because she couldn't accept that the Americans were treating them well. It violated her entire understanding of the world. so she refused to eat, claiming the food was poisoned, refused to work, and spent her days sitting in the corner of the tent muttering to herself about betrayal and shame. The other women tried desperately to reason with her, Sophia saying, "Greta, please eat something. Look at all of us, we're all healthy, no one is being poisoned, it's just food. If we starve ourselves, we're just letting the enemy win, we're killing ourselves." But Greta looked at her with something like pity and said quietly, "Don't you understand? That's exactly what they want. They want us to give up. They want us to accept our defeat. By eating their food and accepting their help, we're admitting that Germany was wrong, that we were wrong, and I cannot do that. I will not do that." Her words silenced the others because they were all struggling with exactly the same thing. Accepting American kindness meant accepting that everything they had believed was a lie. One morning the women woke to find an American captain standing outside their tent, perhaps 40 years old with a serious expression and tired eyes, and he explained through an interpreter that he needed volunteers for a special work detail because there had been a major accident at a nearby German refugee camp where a building had partially collapsed with people trapped inside, and the Americans needed help with rescue efforts, specifically people who could communicate with German civilians and help organize the rescue. The women looked at each other, realizing this was a chance to do something truly important. More than that, it was a chance to prove themselves, to show they could be trusted beyond the fence of the camp, and Sophia volunteered immediately, Anna volunteered, several other younger women volunteered, while Greta watched them with an expression of deep disappointment and betrayal, saying, "You're going to help them, you're going to help the Americans." Sophia met her eyes directly and said, "We're going to help German people who need help, that's what we're doing. And yes, we'll do it with American assistance, that's reality now, and reality isn't always what we hoped it would be." The rescue operation was absolutely grueling and heartbreaking as the women worked alongside American soldiers helping to move debris, identifying trapped victims, pulling people out of the rubble, finding an elderly man with a broken leg, a young boy with a minor head injury, a woman with severe lacerations, and the American soldiers worked without complaint, putting themselves in real danger to get the victims out safely, treating every German civilian they rescued with the same compassion they would have shown their own people. The women watched this in action and something fundamental shifted in their understanding, and Sophia found herself holding steady a beam while an American soldier worked underneath it, thinking that this young man was literally willing to risk his life for people he didn't know, people from the country he had been fighting, because he didn't see them as enemies anymore. He saw them simply as people who needed help, and that was all. The war was over for people like this American soldier. Even if the official peace hadn't been signed yet, the war was genuinely over. Back at the camp that evening, the women gathered outside their tent, and Sophia stood up and began speaking quietly but firmly, saying, "I think we need to accept something. The Americans have shown us nothing but kindness. We came here expecting torture and rape and death. Instead, we've received food and medicine and respect. We've been paid for our work. We've been treated like human beings. I think everything we were told about the Americans was propaganda. I think we were lied to, and I think we need to accept that and move forward." Some of the women nodded slowly while others looked uncertain, and Greta shook her head vigorously, saying, "You're deluded. All of you, you've been brainwashed. The war will come again. Germany will rise again. And when it does, you'll all be marked as traitors for this collaboration." But despite Greta's objections, something had genuinely shifted in the camp. The women began talking openly with the American soldiers, asking questions about America, about life after the war, about what Germany's future might look like, and Sergeant Fletcher brought newspapers and tried to explain articles to Sophia, while Corporal Martinez taught Anna more medical techniques and talked about his plans to return to medical school after the war. And the American soldiers treated the camp not as a place of punishment, but as a temporary situation that everyone was simply trying to make the best of. One warm afternoon in May, news came that the war in Europe was officially over. Germany had surrendered, Hitler was dead, the Reich had collapsed, and the women gathered in the mess tent to hear this announcement formally. And for some of them it was genuine relief, because the dying had stopped. The city bombing had stopped, the hunger would eventually end, But for others like Greta, it was absolute agony because everything they had sacrificed for, everything they had believed in, had been for nothing. The German cause had been utterly defeated. Germany had been completely conquered. That night, the American commander gathered all the prisoners and announced that processing for repatriation would begin soon. The women would be sent home. They would be released. Their imprisonment would end. But the women didn't know how to feel about this because Germany was destroyed. Many of them had no homes to return to. Many had lost family members, and what was waiting for them in a defeated, occupied Germany. The uncertainty was almost as frightening as the initial capture had been. Before the repatriation process began, Anna found herself in the medical clinic with Corporal Martinez one final time, and Martinez sat down with her and spoke seriously, saying, "I want you to know something. You're a good nurse, you're intelligent and kind. Whatever happens next, whatever Germany becomes, remember that you have value. Remember that you can help people. Remember that medicine and healing and compassion, these things are more important than nations or ideologies. Do you understand?" Anna nodded with tears streaming down her face and said quietly, "I didn't believe that 6 weeks ago. I believed in Germany. I believed in the cause. But you showed me something different. You showed me that individual human beings matter more than any cause or flag, and I don't know how to go home and explain that to people." Martinez reached over and gently squeezed her shoulder, saying, "Some people won't believe you. Some people will call you a traitor, but some will listen, and that's enough. That's how the world changes, person by person, heart by heart." The repatriation day arrived with deeply mixed emotions as the women prepared to board transport trucks that would take them to a processing center, wearing simple German dresses provided by the Americans, carrying small packages of supplies provided by the Americans. And as they walked past the fence of the camp, they saw Sergeant Fletcher standing there with a small gift for each of them. For Sophia, a photograph of his farm in Missouri. For Anna, a medical textbook in German that he had somehow obtained. For each of the other women, something personal that showed he had thought about them individually. As they climbed onto the truck, Sophia turned back and called out to Fletcher in English, "Thank you. Thank you for teaching me that Americans are people too. For teaching me that the enemy can be human." And Fletcher smiled sadly and waved back, saying, "Take care of yourselves. Be good to your country. Help it rebuild. Tell people what you've seen here. Tell them there's another way." The truck pulled away from the camp, and the women watched it disappear behind them, knowing they were going home to a destroyed country, to a defeated people, to a future that was entirely uncertain. But they were also going home with knowledge that would change them forever. And the journey back to their various hometowns took weeks because the German infrastructure was completely shattered. Roads were blocked, railways were damaged, and the women traveled slowly and irregularly, sometimes walking, sometimes on trucks, sometimes on trains. And as they traveled, they saw the full scope of what the war had done to Germany, with cities flattened, bridges destroyed, farmland poisoned, refugees crowding the roads, children begging for food, an absolutely apocalyptic landscape of total defeat. When Sophia finally arrived at her parents' home in Stuttgart, she found that the neighborhood had been heavily bombed, but her family's apartment building was still standing, barely, and her parents were alive, though her brother was not, killed on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier, and her father was thin and hollow-eyed, while her mother cried when she saw Sophia alive and relatively healthy, saying, "We thought you would suffer terribly. We thought the Americans would be cruel to you." Sophia looked at her mother and knew she had to tell the truth, even though it was complicated and would confuse her mother, saying quietly, "The Americans treated me with kindness. They fed me well. They treated me as a human being. They showed me that. Everything the propaganda said about them was false." But her mother's face hardened slightly, and she said, "You should not say such things. People will think you're a collaborator." And Sophia replied, "I don't care what people think. I'm going to tell the truth about what I experienced. The Americans aren't the monsters we were told they were. They're just people like us. And maybe if we understand that Germany can rebuild based on something better than what we had before." Anna found her mother living with relatives in Munich after losing her husband to air raids and her younger son to the German army. And when Anna told her about the American medic who had taught her, about the compassionate treatment she had received, about the realization that Americans could be human. Her mother looked at her with profound sadness and said simply, "We were wrong about so much, about everything. Maybe if I had known the truth, I would never have supported the Reich. I would never have encouraged your brother to enlist, but we didn't know or we didn't want to know, and now we have to live with what we did." Anna held her mother and cried, but there was also a strange sense of relief in the admission because finally the truth was being acknowledged. In the weeks and months after returning to Germany, Sophia and Anna and the other women from the camp faced suspicion and accusation. Some people did call them collaborators. Some said they had been corrupted by the Americans. Some couldn't accept that anything good could come from the conquering enemy. But gradually, as Germany began to rebuild under American occupation, the women's testimony began to matter because they could explain to others that the Americans were not cruel overlords but rather a people trying to rebuild a shattered continent, and they could help their countrymen understand that cooperation might be possible, that the future didn't have to repeat the past. Sophia eventually married a German businessman and had children, teaching them about her experience in the camp and about the kindness of an American sergeant named Thomas Fletcher, and she wrote letters to Fletcher for years afterward, learning that he had indeed returned to Missouri and become a successful farmer and raised 3 children, and she never saw him again, but knowing that his life had gone well brought her genuine peace. Anna returned to nursing and worked in a rebuilding German hospital training other nurses, always teaching them what Corporal Martinez had taught her, that healing transcends nationality and ideology, that every patient deserves compassion regardless of where they come from, that medicine is ultimately about seeing the humanity in every person, and she eventually immigrated to America and worked at a hospital in California, not far from where Martinez had told her about his plans and his dreams. The propaganda phrase that had been drummed into German women's minds before capture was that they should expect to be treated as subhuman by American soldiers, that they should expect the worst, that death was preferable to capture. But instead, when the moment came to accept help, when an American doctor or medic extended a hand, the women found they could not refuse because the human part of them that had been buried under years of propaganda and hate began to surface, and the kindness was not a weakness, it was not a trick, it was simply humanity asserting itself over ideology. There had been whispers among the women as they were being processed about places where terrible things would happen, but there were no terrible things. There was only a mediocre camp where women worked and were fed and were paid and were shown respect, where American soldiers saw other human beings and treated them accordingly, where there was the slow, painful dawning realization that everything they had been taught was propaganda designed to control them. The story of these 43 German women and their American captors is one that challenges the easy narratives of war and victory because it suggests that victory can come through kindness as well as through force. It suggests that the enemy is ultimately human and capable of compassion. It suggests that the future does not have to be determined by the past. And these were lessons the women carried with them for the rest of their lives. Lessons about the power of human kindness to overcome propaganda and hate, lessons that remind us that even in the darkest times, even in the aftermath of terrible wars, human beings can choose to see each other's humanity. And that choice made again and again by individual people is exactly how the world actually changes.